Imagine a crime scene where the evidence is undeniable. Not a footprint in the dirt, but a signature written into living DNA. You have a sample. You have the full code. You can measure it, compare it, and test it against every known reference. And then you hit the result no investigator wants to see. No match. Unknown source. Not because the data is bad, not because the technology failed, but because the suspect isn't in the database. This is not science fiction. This is the frontier of human evolutionary genetics. Right now, inside your own body, inside the roughly 3 billion DNA letters that make up your genome, there are stretches of sequence that look unmistakably archaic. They're hominin. They're deeply diverged. And in some cases, the best explanation is that they entered the ancestors of living people through interbreeding with an archaic hominin population we have not yet identified from fossils or ancient genomes. Researchers often call this introgression from a ghost population. Not a ghost because it wasn't real. A ghost because, so far, we can't point to a confirmed skeleton and say, this is them. We can't hold a complete ancient genome and say, this is their reference sequence. What we have is the trace, preserved in the one archive that doesn't sit in a museum, the DNA inside living humans. Today, we go beyond fossils. We follow the genetic evidence, step by step, into one of the strangest truths modern science has uncovered. Parts of human history may be missing from the ground, but not from us. For much of the 20th century, the story of human origins was taught as clean and simple. Modern humans evolved in Africa. Then, roughly 60 to 100,000 years ago, they spread out, and the older human types vanished. That story had a powerful appeal. It was elegant. It was linear. But the clean replacement version of that story is no longer supported. Because in the last 15 years, genetics did something fossils alone could never do. It turned ancient bones into readable evidence. In 2010, researchers published a draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. And suddenly, a question that had been argued for generations became measurable. Did Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbreed? The answer was yes. Today, most people with primarily non-African ancestry carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal-derived DNA. Not because Neanderthals survived as a separate people, but because fragments of them were absorbed into the sapiens lineage. Soon after, another surprise appeared. In a cave in Siberia, a tiny fragment of bone, famously a finger bone, yielded DNA that didn't match Neanderthal or modern human. It belonged to a sister lineage we now call the Denisovans. Once again, the genetics was clear. Denisovans also interbred with modern humans, contributing ancestry to populations in parts of Asia and Oceania, especially in Melanesia. So the tidy picture collapsed. Human evolution was not a single line. It was a braided river, splitting, rejoining, exchanging genes, then splitting again. And that should have been the end of the surprise. Except it wasn't. Because as data sets grew and methods became more precise, researchers began seeing something that didn't fit even this more complex story. Even after accounting for Neanderthal DNA, even after accounting for Denisovan DNA, in some populations, there were still genetic segments that looked older than they should be, more diverged than modern variation alone could explain, and not clearly attributable to any archaic genome we've actually sequenced. A residue, a leftover signal, not a fossil, not a skull, not a tool, a pattern. And patterns in genetics can be evidence. Here is the key idea, and this is where the story becomes both powerful and easy to misunderstand. Geneticists don't find ghosts by guessing. They infer them when models repeatedly fail, until an unknown ancestral source is added. In 2020, a landmark study published in Science Advances analyzed genomes from West African populations, including groups such as the Yoruba and the Mendi. The researchers were not hunting for missing species. They were investigating human variation with practical medical relevance. But when they tried to explain the observed genetic diversity using standard demographic models, the numbers didn't add up. The best-fitting explanations required an additional component: ancestry from an archaic hominin population that was not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, and not represented by any sequenced ancient genome. Now, to be absolutely rigorous, this is not the same as we discovered a new species. What it means is this: when you model the genetic data, one plausible, and in some analyses strongly supported, explanation is that there was interbreeding between ancestors of some living West African populations and a deeply diverged hominin lineage. How much ancestry? Estimates depend on the model, the assumptions, and the method. But some results suggested anything from a few percent up to substantially higher fractions in certain scenarios. Those upper-end estimates are striking. They are also debated. And they are exactly why this topic remains active science rather than settled headline. But one conclusion is hard to escape. The genetic data is consistent with the idea that Africa contained long-separated hominin lineages that persisted late into the timeline of modern humans, and that at least some of them likely exchanged genes with sapiens. So why don't we have a fossil for this? Part of the answer is brutally practical: preservation. Much of tropical Africa is hostile to bone, and especially hostile to ancient DNA. Heat, humidity, microbial activity, and soil chemistry can destroy genetic material rapidly on geological timescales. That doesn't mean fossils don't exist. It means that the places where DNA survives are not the same places where people lived. And the places where people lived are not always the places where remains preserve. So a ghost lineage could be real, and still remain unsampled in our fossil and DNA record. In other words, the ground may be incomplete, but the genome can carry echoes the ground cannot keep. Now comes the part that sounds almost impossible, but is supported by serious published work. When researchers analyzed Denisovan history, they found signals suggesting that Denisovans themselves may have interbred with an even more deeply diverged hominin population, a lineage separated from the ancestors of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans for an extraordinarily long time. This deeply divergent source is often described as a superarchaic lineage. Some models place that split on the order of around 2 million years, an immense span in evolutionary time. Again, rigor matters. We do not have a skeleton labeled superarchaic. We do not have a genome in a freezer that we can point to. What we have is statistical inference from genetic patterns in sequenced archaic genomes. But if the inference is correct, it implies something profound. Interbreeding wasn't a rare accident. It may have been a recurring feature of human evolution. Modern humans are not just sapiens with a small Neanderthal footnote. We are the outcome of repeated contact between branches of the human family tree, some separated by hundreds of thousands of years, possibly even longer, that later reconnected. A biological mosaic. So how do scientists detect ancestry they can't directly sample? The core tools here are not magic. They are mathematics. Population genetics uses statistical models to describe how DNA is inherited, how it recombines each generation, and how mutations accumulate over time. Researchers compare thousands of genomes, track patterns of linkage and divergence, and test whether observed data can be explained by known demographic histories, or whether an additional ancestral source is needed. Sometimes this involves Bayesian inference. Sometimes it involves simulation-based approaches. Sometimes it uses frameworks like hidden Markov models to infer segments of different ancestry along chromosomes. But the principle is always the same. If a chunk of DNA is too divergent, too long, or structured in a way that modern human variation can't explain, the the simplest model may require gene flow from a lineage that split earlier. A useful analogy is language. Imagine reading modern English and finding clusters of words that don't follow English sound changes, words borrowed from a lost language. You might never recover a book written in that language, but the loanwords are still there, embedded in living speech. That is what the genome can be, a living record of contact. If ghost ancestry exists, it doesn't just change a family tree diagram. It changes what it means to be human. Because for most of our existence, we were not alone. For hundreds of thousands of years, the planet likely contained multiple hominin lineages. Neanderthals in Eurasia, Denisovans across parts of Asia, Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, and other groups hinted at by fossils and by genetics. The world was not humans versus animals. It was humans, plural. So what happened? Why is there only one surviving human lineage today? The honest answer is, we don't know in a single, simple sentence. Some lineages may have gone extinct without mixing. Some may have been absorbed. Some may have been replaced. Different regions likely followed different histories. But genetics gives us a fact that fossils alone cannot. At least some of those lineages did not vanish without a trace. They persist as fragments, not as living communities, but as inherited sequences passed down through generations, carried silently in the genomes of people alive right now. And here we must be precise again. Having introgressed DNA from a lineage does not mean that lineage lives on as a people. It means pieces of its biology contributed to the genetic variation of later populations. Some of those pieces may have functional effects. We know this for certain in some cases for Neanderthal and Denisovan introgression, especially involving immunity and adaptation, though the story is complex and not always beneficial. For many inferred ghost segments, the functional impact is still unclear. Some may matter, many may not. Some may be neutral remnants. But whether they are functional or not, they still mean something. They are proof of contact, proof that the past was not a straight line. So where does this go next? This is not a story with a neat ending, and that's exactly why it's real science. Right now, the biggest questions are brutally specific. Can we connect these inferred ghost signals to actual fossils? Can we extract ancient DNA from regions where it rarely survives? Can we use new techniques, like sediment DNA, proteomics, or improved sampling, to identify lineages that genetics currently infers but cannot name? In the coming years, one of two things will happen. Either the evidence for ghost introgression will sharpen, connected to real remains, real dates, real genomes. Or the models will be refined, systematics will be found, and some claims will weaken. Both outcomes would be valuable, because the goal isn't to keep a mystery alive. The goal is to find out what's true. And here is the final perspective shift. We often feel alone as a species. We look at the stars and wonder if anyone else is out there. We look at the great apes and feel the gap. But for most of our evolutionary story, we were not alone on Earth. We were one branch among many, and the evidence suggests we sometimes met, sometimes mixed, and sometimes merged. So the next time you think of human history, don't picture a single march forward. Picture a crowded world. Picture long separated lineages crossing paths. Picture evolution as a network, not a ladder. Because the Earth can erase bones. It can erase footprints. It can erase entire landscapes. But DNA is a different kind of archive. And if living genomes can preserve traces of ancestors we have never named, then the past is not finished revealing itself. The question isn't whether the human story is stranger than we were taught. It is how much stranger it still is. So, do you think we'll identify the next ghost lineage through fossils, or through DNA first? If you liked this video, consider subscribing to the channel. Veil Origins. Impossible Truths.